Good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I've got to say that doing this study of the relationship of age and birth cohort to arts participation has been unique for me as a social scientist. Usually when you do a study, the focus is on finding a strong relationship between two variables, just as Nick's study showed the relationship of arts education to participation. In this case, my primary message is in fact that there isn't very much of a relationship between age and birth cohort and arts participation. That in fact the relationship is quite weak, and that age and birth cohort actually do not help us very much in terms of predicting a person's arts participation. In terms of addressing this issue, I'd like to make two basic points. First of all, that you need to understand what's going on in terms of age and arts participation, in terms of a larger shift in American society away from what I call age standardization. And then secondly, there's a set of statistical features about the nature of arts participation that make what appear to be a relationship between these variables actually not be present. So first let me talk about this broader context, what I call the rise and fall of age standardization. If we look at it very broadly in terms of American history over the 20th century, we can see that for a very large part of the 20th century, the experience of age became a more important variable in terms of determining all sorts of things about our life. This graph I have up now shows a variety of indexes of the transition from childhood to adulthood. You can see on the left, for people who were born in 1930, that in fact this process of moving from age 17 to 39, of moving through events like getting married, leaving your parents' household, leaving school, and having a child of your own, the events were compressed and happened at within a very short period of time for most Americans. Starting with later decades, and especially starting with those born after the 1950s, you can see that this very tight relationship between age and life events tended to give way to a much more loose, less clear relationship. So that this graph on the right is of males born in 1970, and you can see that that cohort took its time going through these various transitions, and that there wasn't that lockstep. The same is true in terms of growing old, in fact, that the events associated with growing old, leaving the workforce, perhaps moving into a new residential setting, at the beginning of the 20th century was not at all standardized. By the middle of the 20th century, it became very sharp, as represented here by the number of people who retired who were retired in 1960, and you can see this very tight increase around age 62, to a much more gradual pattern of this transition to old age that we see looking at more recent decades. So the basic issue here is that we need to understand the nature of arts participation in culture in terms of this broader decline of age standardization. And I think it's related to the fact that, in fact, social structures' influence on how we are involved in the arts has declined over time. Early, a very influential theory in terms of thinking about culture in American society was the cultural capital theorists, who argued that there really was this very strong impact of one's social standing on how one was involved in the arts. Richard Peterson's work on the discovery of what he called cultural omnivores demonstrated that that relationship was not at all clear, that in fact there was this group who were involved in all sorts of genres that were associated with different social standing. And I think more recent work, including Brown and Novak Leonard's monograph that they'll be speaking about shortly, underlines this point that cultural engagement has become destructured, less associated with social structure. So let me move into the data and talk about some of these data issues that come up when you look at the relationship of age, birth cohort, and arts participation. Essentially, this study looks at all SPPA since '82. The dependent variables in the study were attendance, reading, and personal and media participation in the arts, although in this presentation I'm going to focus on the attendance data. And the two independent variables were essentially age, typically broken down into 5-year age groups, and birth cohorts, that is, people who were born at the same time. And here I've grouped the population into 4 basic cohorts. Those born just before or during World War II, the early baby boom generation born immediately after World War II, the late baby boom generation born in the late 50s and early 60s, and the Gen X born in the late 60s and into the early 70s. Let me also point out one other aspect of this that is in the report that I'm not going to be talking about today, which is the impact of the aging of the population on arts participation. Clearly, the American population is getting older, and in the report I do discuss the fact that in essence what's going on, with a few exceptions, is that the arts audience is getting older more or less at the same rate that the overall American population is getting older. If you're interested in that issue, it's in the report. So let me move into some of the issues about the data. As other people have already mentioned, there have been these dramatic declines in arts participation since '92, which seems to be the issue that most people want to try to explain. If we look at the relationship of arts participation to age, it appears that there is this very sharp relationship, with participation rate rising as young adults become middle-aged, and then declining as middle-aged people move into old age. So one of the paradoxes is why what looks like very strong relationships in terms of averages don't end up actually being very influential. And the same is true in terms of the relationship of birth cohorts to arts participation. You seem to see very strong patterns, so why don't we actually see those patterns? Well, let me start with a number of problems involved in terms of interpreting data. The first issue has to do with the highly skewed nature of the distribution about arts participation. On the left here, I have a distribution of respondents to the survey in terms of how many events they attended in the previous year. As you can see, the median number of attendance, the average number of events attended for the average American, is 0, with in various years between 60 and 70% of Americans reporting that they didn't attend any events in the previous year. And that the vast majority, when getting up to near 70 or 80%, are people who attended 2 or fewer events. On the right, we look at the same data, but here we're looking at the percent of events attended broken down by the total number of events that an individual attended. And you can see here that the vast majority of the events attended are accounted for by people who attended more than 7 events in the previous year, whereas at the other end, what was in fact a very large proportion of the population accounts for a very small proportion of all events attended. This fact that the distribution is highly skewed, that there's a lot at the end, means that the average number of events attended actually is not a very good predictor of the overall distribution. That, if you want to think of it, the margin of error around those means is quite large, and it makes an interpretation of the difference between those means somewhat misleading. A third problem which associated with this is that we need to look at ages and birth cohorts' relationship to attendance in the context of other variables that are associated with attendance. This graph looks at a measure of statistical association controlled for the other variables in an analysis. As you can see, educational attainment just literally towers over all these other influences. And age is well below those of both educational attendance, educational attainment, gender, and ethnicity. So when you look at age's influence in terms of a whole set of variables, it turns out to have not a very strong relationship. My screen seems to have frozen. Okay, I'm back. Another problem is that this relationship of age and birth cohort to attendance seems to have declined over time. As you can see, age has never been a particularly influential correlate of arts attendance, but over time that influence has actually declined to a point where in 2008 it explained about 1/2% of all the variance in arts participation. So the relationship has weakened over time. The fifth problem, which is really the capper, is once you introduce all the other influences, once you take into account educational attainment, gender, ethnicity, and a variety of other things, that actually what we thought was this relationship between age and arts participation actually changes, and that rather than seeing this gradual decline in attendance from the 40s as people get older, that in fact attendance is more or less flat from middle age through until people get into their 70s. So again, if we take all of these issues together, what we reach as a conclusion is that despite appearances, age and birth cohort have relatively little influence on cultural participation. We took another tack in terms of looking at this. Rather than looking at aggregate number of events, we looked at type of participants using Richard Peterson's concept of omnivores, people who are frequent consumers of a variety of different types of programs, and highbrows, that is, people who are frequent consumers of a few traditional forms of culture, including classical music, ballet, art museums, and opera. One thing that's gone on, if we look at this over time, is that the proportion of Americans who are identified as either omnivores and highbrow has declined over time. The number of highbrows has declined from around 7% to about 5%, whereas the proportion of omnivores has declined from about 15 to about 10%. It does appear that there is a strong relationship between omnivores, in fact, and age and cohort. As you can see here, the proportion of respondents who were identified as omnivores tended to decline as they got older and tended to decline in terms of successive birth cohorts, with Generation X members having among the lowest propensity of being omnivores. But again, if we go back to that data on who's involved or who accounts for total participation, one of the striking things to emerge from this analysis is that virtually all of the decline in cultural participation between 2002 and 2008, about 84% of it, is accounted for either by the decline in the number of omnivores in the population or the frequency with which omnivores attended cultural events. Taking those two facts together, it explains the vast majority of the overall decline in participation. So I end with a question. If age doesn't actually have very powerful of an influence, why is it that we continue to assume that age actually does have an influence? And I have sort of two answers to that. One has to do with the notion of a cultural lag. We're so used to thinking about life as associated with one's age that it's just hard to give up that pattern. This is associated to some extent with what social psychologists call the pink rhinoceros or white bear phenomenon, where in a social psychology experiment in thought suppression, subjects are asked not to think about something. It seems like, and what they found was that if you ask someone not to think about it, essentially they can't help but think about it. I think we're in a very similar situation in terms of thinking about the relationship of age to arts participation. We're so used to thinking about social life as organized in that way that this new reality, a reality in which essentially many Americans no longer want to act their age, it's just very hard to accept. With that, I'll say thank you and end.
Thank you very much, Mark. So you've seen, following what Nick Rapkin had to share in terms of arts education in the U.S. as registered by classes or lessons people report taking throughout their life, you've now seen some data having to do with age and looking specifically at does it really play a role in determining arts participation habits, and it seems to be the case that it plays a marginal role at best as an isolated factor in looking at why people participate in the arts or how often they do participate in the arts through attendance. There's a question for you, Mark. Why do you think omnivorous attendance is less prevalent in later generations, which was, of course, one of your key findings?
Well, I think it has something to do with this pattern of the destructuring or the lack of connection between social structural variables and participation. This is something I think Alan and Jennifer might want to talk about later. But in essence, the omnivore form was kind of a transition between this period when arts participation was very linked to one's social standing, where, as the cultural capital theorists said, where one sat in society determined what one's tastes were and what one attended. So I think that omnivore pattern really represented a transitional pattern from that kind of fixed, structured nature of arts participation to a much more fluid, flexible, destructured pattern that I think we're seeing emerge today.
Right. There's a question here, which maybe I'll take a stab at and certainly turn it over to you too, Mark, if you have any comments. But it says, people who run arts facilities report that younger people are not attending their events in great numbers. Could it be that the survey captures a variety of ways of attending which have diversified and doesn't get at the places where we see declines in being the greatest, for example, in our music halls? If I'm reading this question correctly, it seems to me that we have actually for a long time focused on particularly arts attendance, even though we don't ask about specific venues, where you might see people go into theaters for live theater performances, dances, etc., as well as opera, ballet, classical music, which implies a lot of times that the venue. But of course we don't ask specifically about the venues. In the future we will actually amend the survey to get into the types of venues people engage with the arts. But I think that question of venue is important, and it does indicate that more information about that might get at other ways of participating. Although we do believe that the questions about attendance so far have at least captured, are sort of venue neutral when we get into those particular art forms, having attended classical music, jazz, theater, or opera or ballet performance, or having seen visual arts exhibits. Do you have anything to add, Mark, about venues?
No, I think you captured that correctly.
So one of the questioners actually does a very helpful service to all of us listening in by trying to synthesize from the two studies. So he's saying, would it be a correct statement to say that arts participation is declining in successive generations, but that most of this drop is explained by fewer people receiving arts education in childhood in successive generations rather than any factors intrinsic to birth cohorts? I actually think that is where the study, to speak for you for a second, Mark, it seems that this is a plausible conclusion from just hearing both of your presentations, although I know you're not attempting to speak for Nick, but what do you think of that statement?
Well, again, typically when people try to disentangle all of these influences, they talk about a cohort, an age influence, and then a period influence. That is the impact of history. And I think what's happening is, obviously participation, at least as measured by these surveys, is going down historically, but it's going down among all generations and all age groups. So and certainly, Nick presents some persuasive evidence that this participation is an important issue in terms of explaining that historical shift.
Factor that you'll see, I think, in the upcoming study from Wolf Brown, I think trying to explain some of these declines also gets into cultural tastes, which of course have changed over time, and so that would likely be a key contributor as well as arts education. But certainly arts education does emerge as a significant predictor of arts participation, as we saw in Nick's study and also in the study you're about to see, where we get into that, where the study actually talks a little bit, I believe, about the relationship between arts education and personal performance and personal creation and other ways people engage in the arts. The question is, if 1992 is the peak for arts participation, according to our data, and we've seen declines since then, is there a correlation between the rise of cable television and alternative media? Any thoughts on that?
I think I'll defer on that to Jennifer and Alan.
Okay. Just to kind of wrap up the Q&A here, wanted to stress again, please feel free to keep submitting questions, and we'll try to get as many of them as we can. But again, we will try to also respond at the end, and we'll take emails with these questions. And of course, I will have a list of all these questions that will inform our work a great deal. One thing I just want to stress, since it was a question that was asked in the prior session, but it's applicable here, is whether we are looking at disentangling variables in our analyses. And I think that's become clearer as we've gone through this webinar, that these studies, a key prerequisite in many of these studies was asking the investigators to really look at these variables apart from each other. So we do feel with some confidence, for example, that education and arts education are highly predictive variables when it comes to participating in the arts, independent of other factors. And so this was also the analysis that was applied in the case of Mark, showing that age seemed to have a relatively weak predictive capability there.